What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have quite a few areas to discuss with you today, starting with our area of interest. That is in the main development region approaching the Lesser Antilles. A tropical wave that's going to be potentially forming behind that, as well as a potential area that David Schlotthauer and I are watching in the Gulf. I'll be talking a little bit about that as well today. So we have a few areas to kind of cover the bases on today, and we've looked at some models with all of this, and we're going to go ahead and dive right into all of it today in this video. Alright, let's go ahead and start with the main meat, obviously, which is our area of interest over here. So here's what we got going on. It does have a 10% chance of formation in the next 7 days. However, as of the latest update, they have expanded the area of interest further to the west, and all of that closer to the Lesser Antilles. I am a little puzzled as to why they're being so conservative with this potential with the probabilities, that is, excuse me. But I will say I have been watching the models. I have been keeping an eye on the ensembles and all of that stuff. They have been uptrending and all that stuff, but I do think that's also important to pay attention to kind of the wave and see how that's been operating. But with that being said, let's go ahead and discuss what the NHC is thinking right here. A tropical wave located about 1,000 miles east-southeast of the Lesser Antilles continues to produce disorganized showers and thunderstorms. Environmental conditions appear only marginally conducive for development during the next day or so, while the system moves west-northwest at 10-15 miles per hour. By the middle of the week, environmental conditions are forecast to become unfavorable for further development. They're only giving this a 10% probability of development in the next 48 hours and 7 days. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on, something to pay attention to as well. But looking at satellite, I will say I am a little puzzled with that analysis right here. And the reason I'm a little puzzled with this is primarily because I've been looking at the wave itself, and yes, it's still relatively disorganized, but it is kind of healthy at this current point. I think the main thing that they're watching, the main thing they're paying attention to, is the fact that this system hasn't exactly detached from the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, and it's been kind of relying on that for its convection so far. And I think that's kind of why they haven't pulled the trigger on a higher probability of development. Even though some models are calling for this to detach, and even though the ensembles are calling for this to detach in the next 12 to 24 hours, at this current point, I think the NHC is holding off and going, okay, let's wait and see how this evolves once it detaches from the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Then we'll get off from there as well and see what happens. But ultimately, regardless of that, the area does look relatively healthy, I will say. You do have some outflow that's starting to kick in a bit more. You're noticing several outflow kind of channels that you're looking at right here. The most recent one that's kind of becoming the most healthy is the one closest to the convection, so you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. I do, though, want to point out something on the water vapor imagery, and this has kind of been the main thing I've been keeping an eye on. There is quite a bit of dry air to the north of the convection and to the north of the wave right here. That is something you need to pay very close attention to, folks, because that dry air is kind of being a bit of a hindrance as well. I've noticed now, granted, the outflow is there, and it's kind of helping mix out some of that dry air at this current point in time. However, I've been watching it, and it does seem like the dry air, particularly the Sahara dust in this part of the Atlantic, is the main reason why they're kind of a bit skeptical with tropical development. So that's something to keep a close eye on and something to pay attention to as well. But regardless, still off to a pretty decent start right here. And even if this system doesn't develop, I do want to make it clear that regardless of development, there's still going to be a lot of flash flooding potential for parts of the Lesser Antilles, for Puerto Rico, heck, even into Hispaniola, as the system moves further to the west. So I do want to make that clear, and that's why I'm kind of talking about this, because this does pose a threat in terms of whether it's tropical development or flash flooding. It does pose a threat to the Antilles regardless. So I think that's something to kind of highlight as well. Another thing I do want to kind of take a quick gander at is the ensembles with this, because I've been watching them. We'll go ahead and show you these right here. And this is what we have going on right here. I've zoomed into this. I've kind of showed you what we're looking at. This is what we have in the next 72 hours right here. I actually want to go ahead and go back to the 24 hours out to kind of show you what these runs are thinking. So basically what we're looking at right here is, according to the ensembles, it does look like that the wave will detach from the ITCZ in the next 24 hours or so, and it's going to start off in a more northwestward motion right there, and then it's going to start speeding up as it starts to move away from the ITCZ and really start to turn up in terms of that as it approaches the Lesser Antilles. But what you're noticing with this is you're noticing there's a lot more power with these ensembles as well. I've been looking at this. We're looking at 1,005, 1,001, 1,005 in a lot of these areas right here. And you're looking at those wind speeds getting up to 40 to 50 miles per hour, or 40 to 50 knots, I would say. And that's something interesting to kind of take into consideration and something to keep in mind. Looking at the 12Z right here, just to show you for comparison, didn't have as much concentration, didn't have as much power to it or anything like that, but ultimately what you did have was kind of more scattering, and it was still a signal, but relatively weak. Now looking at the 0Z, this is a pretty considerable uptrend right here from the euro, and it is a little questionable for me, I will admit, because we're kind of seeing this back and forth with more power, less power, all of that stuff. So I do want to wait again for more data and information, particularly the 12Z, to see, okay, is this just a fluke? Is this a one-time thing? Or is this actually going to happen? Right here. But what you're noticing is, and even if we go out to 96 hours right here, you're noticing that definitely right here, there's more power to this, and there's also a bit more of a detachment. You're noticing a bit of a split in the ensembles that are showing this. Some want it moving further up to the north, and some want it moving further to the south, which I do think is kind of interesting, and I can go ahead and show this over right here. I will say this, though. Once it gets to the Caribbean, the odds of it developing, if it doesn't do it by then, isn't going to happen, because you're going to notice more dry air. There's going to be more wind shear in that region as well to take into account. So that's just something I did want to go ahead and point out. Regardless, though, you still have good water conditions for development across a lot of this region, where this is currently at right now. It's in an area of around 28 to 29 degrees Celsius of water temperatures, which is about 2 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you living in the United States and its territories as well. But ultimately, you still have that warm water factor that I've been talking about. It's going to be in an area of even warmer water, around 29 degrees Celsius briefly, before it starts moving to the northwest. And then after that, it's going to be in solidly 28 degrees Celsius, which is still more than enough for tropical development, regardless of where you're at. But I did want to point that out, and I also wanted to point out the ocean heat content with this as well. All right, so this is the ocean heat content. This is of July 16th. I'm going to see if they have one up for the 20th. Okay, the OHC maps are kind of bugging out right here. Hopefully we can get them back in order from sooner rather than later, but OHC from the 16th, at least according to these charts, you're looking at the OHC where the system's at currently around 50 to 75 OHC along the intertropical convergence zone, and that doesn't seem like that much from the grand scheme of things, especially compared to the Western Atlantic, but 50 to 75 OHC, which then jumps to 75 to 100 OHC, that's pretty good for decent strengthening right there, and good for decent convection, and good for development regardless of that right there. So that's another interesting tidbit I did want to point out. The main inhibitors I'm noticing with this is going to be like dry air, and I've noticed, and we can go ahead and pull this up right here. So here's what we have for you right here. Let's go ahead and pull up the 700 to 300 millibar water temperatures, not the water temperatures, the moisture right here. I apologize for that. What you have is a lot of dry air to its north and to its west right here, kind of in this moisture pocket. Right here. Now, I will say this, as long as the system stays in that dry pocket, and as long as the outflow mixes out some of this dry air, I meant moisture pocket, I apologize, but it should have decent probability of development before it gets to the Lesser Antilles, but I would say it has about 3-ish days for it to get its act together for its best possible result. And then after that, I don't really see that much potentially happening as it gets to the Antilles, because wind shear is going to start tearing it apart, dry air is going to start tearing it apart. But I will say this, though, it could cause some pretty considerable flash flooding regardless of development, and that's something I've highlighted a lot in this video. But that's kind of where I'm at right here. The dry air is mainly the biggest inhibitor to this right here. Taking a quick look at the wind shear with this as well. Wind shear, yes, it's not really that bad right now as well. A lot of it's to the north, I would say, but if the outflow does get caught into that, it could help consolidate the system a bit more once it detaches from the ITCZ, and once it starts to organize and develop, it could help consolidate it. But then you're noticing an increase of wind shear in the next 3 days or so, and that's also a reason why I'm saying you got 72 hours to do it before wind shear starts to tear the structure apart. And kind of that's the end of your last possible development for your biggest probabilities of it. So that's kind of your situation that we have right here. We have about 2 to 3 days of possibilities left to happen, but it needs to detach from the ITCZ sooner rather than later and develop convection on its own before it can get designated, as well as develop a mid-level circulation, a low-level circulation as well, and all the other stuff that we pay attention to here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. And I'll talk more about like what the operational runs are showing a little bit later, but I do want to pivot a bit more towards our couple of other low pressure systems that I've been watching, or potential low pressure systems, one in the MDR and one in the Gulf. We're going to start with the Gulf one first, since that poses the biggest threat to land. And I will stress this, I've been watching this. It does go out to start out about 4 to 5 days from now, so that's something to take into consideration. But I did actually talk about this on David's stream last night. I was on his stream. Thank you very much, David, for having me on. And I did discuss the potential development probabilities of what's going on in the Gulf, because there's a low pressure system. And I had some skepticisms with it. And I'm going to go ahead and play the clip right there of my analysis, and I'll let it speak for itself. Yeah, as for the Gulf system, right now, because this is a new analog I've noticed. Like, this has just popped up in the last day or so. I've from what I've seen from the runs that I've looked at. For me, I'm a little skeptical of like full-blown tropical development, in part because of what happened with Invest 93L. I remember that story where it was supposed to be this big bad system, but ultimately a lot of things went wrong, starting with overconvection and oversaturate and sublimation of those storms that happened in Florida, to the system being further to the north than what we were expecting, to the system not even hitting water properly, and then just kind of dissipating from then on out. I'm a little skeptical in the pattern in the track of it. The thing I want to boil this down to is, how far away from the coast is this low going to dig? Is it going to be like a borderline to the coast, or is this going to be further away and we'll have a safer bet of potential tropical development? That's my main skepticism with this. In terms of that, do I think it's still going to be a threat? Yes, it's still going to be a pretty big flash flooding threat. I know a lot of Louisiana got flash flooding recently, particularly around New Orleans, Baton Rouge, those areas that do have pumps and all of that, but they only take in a certain amount of water per hour. So that's something to take into account as well. Just because it doesn't form doesn't mean it's a threat. 93L was still very much a threat. Because of flash flooding risk, both in Florida and across much of the Gulf Coast. But right now, with development, I am a little skeptical with this, in part because of what we saw with 93L, and in part because I want to know I want more consistency with the data and the models, and I really want to know, is this going to be over water, or is this going to be closer to land where we have more of a borderline case? Conditions do seem good initially. I have looked at those. But my main issue with that is just the proximity to land, and that's kind of your main situation right there. So that's my take on it. Just wait for more data. We'll probably have some more the next day or so. So that's kind of why I'm a little hesitant right there. I'm not really showing any runs or any models or anything like that because, well, number one, David kind of already did that for me in the stream. But I'm also not showing that because right now there's a lot of uncertainty with it. And I think once we get more data and information, and maybe in the next couple of days or so, then I could talk more about that. But I just wanted to briefly mention that very quickly, since there have been some people asking about that, so I did want to stress that very quickly. But the last thing I do want to go ahead and talk about, at least in terms of a potential area of development, is what another low pressure system potentially in the main development region. So let's go ahead and go to satellite imagery, and we'll go ahead and go to the eastern Atlantic. What's going to be happening here is there's going to be a tropical wave that comes off the coast of Africa. I'm not sure if it's this one or the next one. I'll have to keep you updated on that. But there is a tropical wave that's going to be moving off the coast of Africa, and it's going to potentially be bring another moisture pocket right there. I was kind of alluding to it earlier when I was showing you the moisture. We can actually go ahead and show you that once again. Taking a quick look at the 700 to 300 millibar moisture right here. Yeah, the tropical wave does come off in the next couple of days or so, and it brings a pretty considerable moisture pocket across much of the region right here. It kind of keeps the dry air and the Sahara dust away from the tropics for a little bit, but then you start noticing as this pocket moves through, more dry air starts to entrain in it a little bit, and kind of this moisture pocket kind of gets eviscerated as it approaches the Lesser Antilles. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. That's something I'm considering, and even with the wind shear charts, taking a quick gander at those, it's actually in a decent environment for wind shear as well. Yes, a lot of the wind shear is to its south, but then you're noticing the wind shear is lifting more and more up to its north as well. And another thing I do want to note with the wind shear is after this one area of interest that we're watching moves into the Caribbean, before we were looking at more concentrated wind shear across much of the region right there. Now we're seeing more scattered, and we're seeing more up and down going all over the place. So I do want to emphasize that as well, taking a quick gander at that. So that's kind of what we're looking at. We're looking at the wind shear fluctuating, particularly across parts of the eastern Caribbean right there. In fact, by 10 days out, you're noticing not very much wind shear across much of the Caribbean, with the exception of the northwestern region right there, obviously. And yes, it does come back a little bit, but it's not nearly as powerful as what it was before until maybe towards the end of the run. So that's a pretty big development with that as well. So that's also something you need to take into account as well. So with that being said, right there, you're looking at more and more favorable conditions across much of the Atlantic. You're looking at more and more tropical waves starting to develop. And I kind of talked about this on stream last night. I think late July to early August, or technically in late July right now, is going to be when the tropics wakes up more in the MDR, and it's kind of starting to show with that AOI that's been tagged, another low pressure system from a tropical wave potentially developing. So that's something to take into account. Now, I'm not going to go out here and say that we're going to see big mega category 5 hurricanes from all of this or anything like that. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is basically the chances of tropical development from these waves do increase considerably in late July to early August because of better and better conditions, and that's what I'm considering, and that's what I'm taking into account right there. So with that being said, I can go ahead now and shift over to the operational runs, and we can kind of run them from there. Ensembles do show a better picture of the development than the operational runs do at this current point, but even still, the European does have something trying to bug out a little bit, although the operational is kind of a little bit behind from the ensembles, so that's something to take into consideration as well. In terms of the low pressure system behind it, it remains an open wave, although it does make attempts to close it off, potentially as it moves through the MDR, although dry air is going to be the main inhibitor to that, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. So let's go ahead now and show you the GFS, pulling back to the 0Z. Right here, 0Z GFS does have a closed low happening with this system, but it remains pretty disorganized. Tropical depression strength as it approaches the Antilles still causes a lot of flash flooding regardless of what happens with that, but that's kind of the situation that you're dealing with right there. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, something to consider. 12Z GFS, just out of curiosity, not really showing as much, so we'll have to pay attention to see how these runs do end up panning out. Because kind of the models have been kind of all over the place, at least with the operational runs. The ensembles have remained surprisingly consistent with this. So that's also something that I have been keeping in mind. But regardless, this does pose a threat, and we have other areas to watch as well. And this is something that we will continue to keep you updated here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and close the video out right here. I really hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you want to help out, hang out, or ask us some questions, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.